The entire class laughed when the professor challenged a quiet freshman with an impossible math problem, just to humiliate him. What they didn't know: that freshman was hiding a secret, a mind sharper than anyone in the room. And when he picked up the marker, everything changed. Is this really the best our scholarship program could find? The words sliced through the heavy air of the lecture hall like a razor, and for a moment, you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Pens hovered above notebooks. Every single head turned toward Jamal Carter, a quiet, 19-year-old freshman sitting in the last row. He froze. His stomach twisted into knots. Jamal had only been on campus for 2 weeks. This, his first semester at Rutherford University, was supposed to be the beginning of something life-changing. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunity was a rare visitor, he'd dreamed of this moment for years. Rutherford was the place for brilliant minds. It was where futures were built, where names became legends in academic circles. And somehow, against the odds, he had made it here on a full-ride scholarship. But instead of a warm welcome or an encouraging first class, he was being publicly singled out by Professor Whitmore. Whitmore stood tall at the front of the lecture hall, his neatly pressed suit perfectly tailored, his salt and pepper hair combed to precision. His eyes, sharp and cold, scanned Jamal with the same look one might give a stray dog wandering into a fine dining restaurant. "I hear you're on a full scholarship," Whitmore said, his voice dripping with smug authority. His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. Jamal swallowed hard, unsure whether to respond or just keep quiet. The heat in his face burned hotter as a few students in the front row snickered. "Let's see," Whitmore continued, "if you can earn it." With deliberate slowness, he turned to the whiteboard. He uncapped a marker with a sharp pop and began scribbling. Line after line of symbols appeared, numbers, Greek letters, strange curves, and formulas that twisted across the board like vines. The squeak of the marker echoed in the room. Jamal's eyes widened. Even without fully processing it yet, he knew this wasn't just any math problem. When Whitmore stepped aside, the equation looked more like an abstract piece of art than something meant to be solved. "This," the professor said with a dramatic sweep of his hand, "is the Rutherford conjecture." A few students gasped quietly. Others smirked knowingly. Everyone in the mathematics department knew about the Rutherford conjecture. It was a notoriously difficult problem, one that had stumped students for decades. Solving it wasn't just hard, it was considered almost impossible without years of postgraduate training. "It's considered unsolvable at an undergraduate level," Whitmore went on, locking eyes with Jamal as though issuing a personal challenge. "But maybe," his lips curled into a smirk, "you'll surprise us." The words dripped with condescension. He didn't believe for a second that Jamal could do it. This wasn't an academic exercise, this was a trap, a setup meant to humiliate. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Some students turned in their seats to get a better look at the new guy. Others whispered to each other, clearly anticipating a crash and burn moment. Jamal's palms grew damp. He could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. For a second, he considered lowering his eyes, shrinking into his seat, and letting the moment pass. After all, he had nothing to prove to these people. But then he noticed Whitmore's expression, smug, certain, dismissive. The kind of look Jamal had seen his whole life from people who had already decided who he was and what he was capable of before he even opened his mouth. He clenched his jaw. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. From the corner of the room, a student muttered under their breath, "This is gonna be good." Another chuckled. Whitmore leaned casually against the desk, as if settling in to watch a slow, painful defeat. The equation loomed large on the board, a mountain meant to be unclimbable. And at that moment, the lecture hall wasn't just a classroom, it was an arena, and Jamal was being shoved into the center without a weapon. Every second of silence stretched longer, and Jamal could feel his pulse thudding in his ears. They wanted him to fail. They expected him to fail. And Professor Whitmore was enjoying every second of it. What the students in that lecture hall didn't know, and what Professor Whitmore certainly didn't care to find out, was that Jamal Carter's journey to this room was nothing short of extraordinary. Jamal had been born and raised in Brooksville, a small, overlooked town where opportunity didn't just pass you by, it usually never came in the first place. The roads were cracked, the library was outdated, and the local schools operated on tight budgets that left little room for advanced classes or fancy programs. But inside that rough exterior of a town, in a tiny two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, lived a boy with a mind built for numbers. From the time he could count, Jamal had a fascination with patterns. At age 6, while other kids were learning basic addition, he was already figuring out multiplication tables for fun. He would sit by the window at night, staring at the flickering streetlights, imagining number sequences in the way they blinked. But life in Brooksville was far from easy. His mother, Denise Carter, worked double shifts, morning hours at the diner and evenings cleaning offices, just to keep food on the table and rent paid. His father had left when Jamal was 4, and from that day forward, Denise became both parent and provider. She often came home exhausted, her feet aching, but she never once complained in front of Jamal. Instead, she'd smile and ask, "So, what did you learn today, baby?" And Jamal always had something to share. He devoured library books on math, engineering, and logic puzzles, many far beyond his grade level. The librarians began setting aside college-level math books for him, shaking their heads in amazement when he'd return them in just a few days. By middle school, he was doing algebra and geometry without guidance. By the time he reached high school, he was tutoring his teachers on advanced concepts they hadn't studied in years. His school didn't offer calculus, so Jamal taught himself, using free online lectures and borrowed textbooks. It wasn't just academics that shaped him, it was the constant reminder that the world outside Brooksville didn't expect much from kids like him. He saw classmates give up on their dreams because they believed no one like them could make it out. But Jamal refused to accept that fate. He knew he had a gift, and he was determined to use it. At 14, Jamal entered a regional math competition, one dominated by elite prep schools with well-funded STEM programs. He walked in wearing his only clean button-up shirt, armed with nothing but a notepad in his mind. By the end of the day, he had won first place by a landslide, solving problems that stumped even the prep school coaches. His victory made the local paper, but outside Brooksville, it barely caused a ripple. Despite the win, Jamal stayed humble. He never boasted about his abilities. He understood that talent alone wouldn't protect him from prejudice, and in a world quick to judge by appearances, he learned to keep his brilliance quiet. When he applied to Rutherford University, a place where tuition alone cost more than his mother made in a year, he did it on a dare to himself. He poured his heart into his application essay, detailing his passion for problem solving and his vision of using mathematics to create solutions for real-world problems. He sent it off expecting nothing. When the acceptance letter arrived, along with news of a full academic scholarship, his mother cried for hours. Jamal promised her that he would make the most of it, that he would walk into that university and prove he belonged there. But Rutherford was a world apart from Brooksville. The campus buildings looked like castles, the students wore designer clothes, and conversations often revolved around vacations in Europe or internships lined up by wealthy relatives. Jamal felt like an outsider the moment he stepped foot on campus. Still, he kept his head down, went to class, and reminded himself of his mother's words the night before he left home. "Baby, you don't let nobody tell you you don't belong. You've worked too hard for this." Those words echoed in his head the morning he walked into Professor Whitmore's class, unaware that he was about to be put on the spot in front of dozens of strangers. Little did they know, the quiet scholarship kid they were ready to laugh at had a mind sharper than anyone in that room, including the professor. The classroom felt heavier now, as if the air itself was pressing down on Jamal. The Rutherford conjecture glared back at him from the whiteboard, a monstrous wall of symbols and numbers designed to intimidate. For a moment, Jamal's instinct was to sink lower into his seat, let the uncomfortable laughter pass, and wait for the professor to move on. After all, this wasn't his fight. He hadn't come to Rutherford to show off or challenge anyone. He'd come to learn. But then he caught Professor Whitmore's eyes, cold, calculating, and laced with satisfaction. The man wasn't just giving him a problem, he was delivering a public execution. The murmurs in the room grew louder. "Man, he's gonna crash hard," someone whispered. "I give him 2 minutes before he walks out," another chuckled. Jamal took a deep breath. And then, as clearly as if she were standing beside him, he heard his mother's voice from that last night in Brooksville. "Baby, you don't let nobody tell you you don't belong. You've worked too hard for this." Those words lit a fire inside him. Slowly, he rose from his seat. Chairs squeaked as a few students turned to get a better view. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? You're actually going to try?" the professor said, voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Please, the board is yours." Jamal walked down the steps of the lecture hall toward the front, each footstep echoing against the tile. He could feel dozens of eyes following him. Some were amused, some curious, a few almost pitying. When he reached the board, he picked up the marker. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear of the problem itself, but from the weight of what this moment meant. If he failed, it would confirm every doubt people had about him. If he succeeded, well, nobody in this room would ever look at him the same way again. He studied the problem for a few seconds, not rushing. In his mind, the scattered mess of symbols began to align, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. He recognized parts of the equation from research papers he'd read late at night back in Brooksville. The Rutherford conjecture was infamous because it wasn't just about solving, it was about seeing connections most people missed. Jamal uncapped the marker fully and made his first line on the board. Then another. The squeak of the marker was the only sound in the room now. Students who had been leaning back casually in their seats were suddenly leaning forward, watching closely. He worked methodically, breaking the equation into smaller chunks, rewriting terms, applying a pattern he had discovered years ago while solving an unrelated problem. Each step was clean, confident, precise. Whitmore's smirk faltered. The longer Jamal wrote, the quieter the room became. There was no hesitation in his movements now, just a steady rhythm of thought and action. He was no longer aware of the eyes on him, the world had narrowed down to him, the board, and the numbers. 15 minutes later, Jamal capped the marker and stepped back. He pointed to the final boxed answer at the bottom of the board. "There," he said, voice calm but firm. "That's the solution." A few students glanced at each other in disbelief. One whispered, "No way, did he actually?" Whitmore walked slowly toward the board, eyes scanning the work. His fingers tapped against his chin. The silence stretched on until he finally stepped back, face pale. Not only had Jamal solved the equation, he had done it in a way that was both elegant and original. His method alone was worth studying. And for the first time, Whitmore had no clever insult ready. The silence in the lecture hall felt electric. Students stared at the board as if it were some kind of magic trick. But this wasn't magic, it was skill. Pure, undeniable brilliance. Professor Whitmore lingered at the front, eyes darting over the steps Jamal had written. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for once, the man who always had a cutting remark was speechless. Finally, he managed, Where did you learn that?" Jamal shrugged lightly, his tone casual. "I taught myself." A few gasps and muffled laughs rippled through the students, not mocking, but stunned. The boy they'd assumed was just another quiet scholarship kid had just done something that most graduate students wouldn't even attempt. One student in the front row whispered, "That's impossible, that's doctoral level work." Another added, "He just destroyed Whitmore in front of everybody." Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Well, I suppose you got lucky," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But luck had nothing to do with it, and everyone in that room knew it. By the next morning, the story was already making its way across campus. It started as whispers in the math department, but soon it spread to engineering, physics, and even the humanities. People referred to him simply as that freshman who solved the conjecture. Students who had never spoken to Jamal before suddenly stopped him between classes, asking questions or congratulating him. Some wanted help with assignments, others just wanted to see if the rumors were true. The professors noticed too. 2 of them emailed him, inviting him to join advanced study groups usually reserved for seniors. One even forwarded his solution to a colleague at another university, calling it a fresh and fascinating approach. The biggest surprise came later that week when the dean of mathematics requested to meet him. Jamal sat nervously in the dean's richly furnished office, expecting a formality. Instead, the dean leaned forward and said, "What you did in Professor Whitmore's class, well, it's extraordinary. I'd like to offer you a position as a paid research assistant. Normally, we reserve these for upperclassmen, but you're clearly an exception." It was the kind of opportunity that could open doors far beyond Rutherford. Still, despite the recognition, Jamal stayed grounded. He didn't gloat, didn't post about it online, and didn't rub it in Whitmore's face. He kept going to class like normal, though now, every time he entered the lecture hall, the energy was different. Students no longer saw him as an outsider. They saw him as someone who belonged, someone to be respected. And for Whitmore? The once arrogant professor now avoided making sarcastic comments when Jamal raised his hand. In fact, on more than one occasion, he asked Jamal for his opinion during discussions. One thing was clear: Jamal hadn't just solved the math problem. He had shifted the balance of power in that room, and maybe even at the entire university. The next week, when Jamal walked into Professor Whitmore's lecture, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Before, people barely looked up when he entered. Now, conversations paused for a second, and heads turned, some nodding in acknowledgement, others smiling. It wasn't the awkward curiosity of strangers anymore, it was recognition. Professor Whitmore stood at the front, shuffling his notes. When his eyes met Jamal's, there was no smirk this time, just something that almost resembled respect. "Mr. Carter," Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the hall, "why don't you take the lead on today's problem?" There was a brief stir among the students. A week ago, it would have been a setup for humiliation. But now, it was an invitation. Jamal stepped to the front without hesitation. Picking up the marker felt different this time. He wasn't trying to prove himself anymore, he already had. As he explained the problem, his voice steady and clear, he noticed how the room's energy had changed. Students leaned forward, taking notes, nodding at his explanations. Even Whitmore stood to the side, listening closely, occasionally glancing at Jamal's work with something between pride and disbelief. When he finished, a few students clapped quietly, not the kind of loud applause you'd hear at a performance, but the kind of respectful acknowledgement that said, "You've earned this." After class, Whitmore approached him. "I misjudged you," he admitted quietly, so only Jamal could hear. "You belong here, more than most." Jamal didn't respond with arrogance or bitterness. He simply smiled and said, "Thank you, Professor." That night, Jamal called his mom. She answered on the second ring, already sounding tired from her double shift. "Hey, baby," she said. "How's school treating you?" Jamal smiled, leaning back in his chair. "It's good, Mom. Really good." He told her about the problem, about the way the students reacted, about the research offer from the dean. He could hear the emotion in her silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, "I told you. You worked too hard to let anyone tell you you don't belong." Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly. "And you were right." When the call ended, Jamal sat for a long moment in the quiet of his dorm room. He thought about how, just a week ago, he was the new kid, easy to underestimate, easy to dismiss. Now, people didn't just know his name. They respected it. For the first time since arriving at Rutherford, Jamal didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't just surviving here, he was thriving. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Because the world was full of problems that people said were unsolvable. And Jamal Carter had just proved that sometimes, they're wrong. And that's how one quiet freshman turned humiliation into respect, proving that true talent speaks louder than prejudice. If this story inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Your support helps us share more moments that change lives.